So I am, as Olga said, I'm doing a project on migration by LGBT people from Poland, Russia and Brazil to London and to Berlin. What I'm presenting today is a sort of a previous research project which looks at attitudes towards LGBT people by the broader migrant population. We did a large-scale questionnaire of 2,648 people, and then we did in-depth interviews with 60 more people. The overall aims of the project were sort of split between looking at the sexual behaviour of migrants from Central and Eastern Europe, and then also looking at their attitudes towards aspects of sexuality. And it was the last aim that I was particularly interested in, and I sort of led on that aspect of the research. So we sort of asked them about their attitudes towards a sort of a range of sexual sort of issues, but what I want today is just to sort of look at their attitudes towards homosexuality. The biggest sort of overall finding, the headline finding that we found, was the longer the migrants were in London, the more tolerant they became of homosexuality. We found that intolerance towards homosexuality reduced over a sort of a period of 4 years, and then sort of plateaued. And when we sort of looked at the three biggest groups in our sample, they were the Poles, the Lithuanians and the Romanians, we found that sort of initially, for the first year or so, actually attitudes got a bit worse. They became slightly more intolerant, but then after that they became less and less intolerant over the rest of their time in London. When we tried to sort of think of reasons why they would become more intolerant after they moved to the UK, we thought partly it was to do with the fact that suddenly homosexuality and gay people were much more visible in the UK, so that might have partly have been just sort of the shock of having been sort of confronted with sort of more images of sort of LGBT people compared with the much less visible lower level of visibility to sort of zero in sort of some cases, I think particularly in Romania. But certainly in Lithuania and Poland as well, much less visibility. Also, when migrants arrive in a destination society, very often they tend to spend their initial years in sort of close connection with the diaspora community. Particularly if they don't speak the English language very well, it's much easier to sort of remain within their own communities. And diasporas also sort of help sort of psychologically with the transition of moving to another country. They help find work, this sort of thing. Because of that, being among you, people of your own ethnic group can then often sort of reinforce sort of traditional ideas, because diasporas sort of try to recreate or at least maintain the culture and the identity from their homeland. Very often diasporas end up being more traditional than the countries they've left behind. This was sort of two of the reasons that we thought sort of explained why there was a sort of an increase in intolerance in the first year or two, but then after that it gradually declined. And there were a number of reasons that we found to explain why attitudes became more tolerant. The main reasons we thought were new normality, greater visibility, personal contact, and public debate. So the first thing that we sort of discussed was just the sort of very act of moving out of their country, not necessarily sort of coming to the UK in particular, but the fact that they sort of left their home countries meant that they were often sort of extricated from a lot of the negative discourse that was sort of continually sort of parroted in their home countries, particularly sort of from the media. There was sort of continuous sort of negative reporting of LGBT issues in the media. Politicians often use homophobia sort of instrumentally to sort of gain support. And then in particular the churches in the three countries also took a very negative position. So just sort of actually being outside of that discourse meant they weren't constantly bombarded with negative attitudes. So Laima, a woman from Latvia, sort of pointed out, sort of, I think in my country people still have problems accepting homosexuality, and of course here it's totally normal. I think she's overestimating the degree of British tolerance, but nevertheless, sort of relatively speaking, it is considered more normal than it would be in their home country. Visibility was something that lots of the people we spoke to mentioned. The woman from Estonia, Piret, she said that it was sort of not very visible. Homosexuality was not very visible in Estonia. So she said you just didn't get used to it just because you never saw it. Jarek, a young Polish man, he was sort of confronted. He moved to Brighton, and I tried to keep a straight face when he told me this. He said, "I don't know if you know, but Brighton is the English capital of gay men." I wasn't aware of this when I moved there, but in general I must say it helped me because I was very negative and now I'm indifferent. So just sort of seeing the sort of greater visibility of LGBT people in the home country sort of helped normalise it. But the biggest impact that we found was the correlation between personal contact and positive attitudes. Once people came into contact, sort of worked with gay people, had gay neighbours, or just sort of became friends with gay people, it was sort of much more difficult for the stereotypes that they had grown up with in their home countries to be maintained. This is a sort of a field of ethnic conflict studies, actually, called the contact hypothesis, that if you sort of have personal contact with people, then you're much less likely to sort of maintain the negative stereotypes, because the people that you actually meet just don't conform to this sort of negative stereotype. There's been a lot of research which has found that the more contact you have with sort of the other, then the less sort of foreign they appear, and the less sort of threatening they appear. And so sort of coming to the UK, I mean, Nina's response was sort of quite typical. She said, at home I don't even remember having met a homosexual. For a lot of people, it was sort of coming to the UK, it was the first time they actually sort of personally met a gay person. Jarek, again, the guy from Brighton, he said, I had a few friends and I didn't know that they were gay. And I learnt this too late. And he was my friend already, so I decided it was okay. Jarek was a great source of quotes, and so that was one of my favourites. So I would have reacted to it some years ago, but here it's normal, and I had to get used to it, so it was effective in a way. So he sort of really sort of sums up that. But it was interesting that some people only had contact with sort of gay men over here, and some only had contact with gay women. And so Snieżana, for example, had sort of a lot of contact with gay men, and so her attitudes towards gay men became more positive. But she didn't know sort of any lesbians, and so the stereotypes of lesbians continued. She sort of continued to hold sort of quite stereotypical view of lesbians. I haven't had many contact with gay women. To be honest, I prefer gay men. I get along with them well. The gay women I have seen mostly look sullen. So this is sort of stereotype of sort of grumpy lesbian was she sort of managed to maintain because she admitted she didn't know any. Overall, the statistical sort of analysis sort of had this sort of very quite sort of positive overall sort of decline in negative attitudes. When we looked at the qualitative analysis of interviews, the picture was a bit more mixed. Partly there was a sort of a slight difference in gender, by sort of gender. Women were sort of more tolerant than men, but the difference actually wasn't particularly marked, and also that sort of feeds into sort of general sort of literature on attitudes. Women in general tend to be more tolerant towards homosexuality. Another thing we found that there's this sort of positive attitude towards gay people. It wasn't towards all gay people. There was a sort of a preference for those who were sort of gender conforming. They weren't sort of necessarily more positive to gays and lesbians in general. It was a particular kind of gays and lesbians, those that sort of fitted in. Who's that? Lisu, the Estonian woman. I have nothing against homosexuals. I wouldn't even mind trying a girl myself. But what I don't like, especially about women, I don't like that they try to behave like a man, this kind of hairy woman. And again, Janos, for a woman, for me, a woman should be feminine and a man should be manly, that's it. So if the men and the women conform to specific gender stereotypes, then they're acceptable. If they don't, then, as Jarek, our friend Jarek from Brighton, I saw two lesbians who reminded me more of men than women, and this was repulsive. This sort of more positive attitude, you sort of have to sort of take it with a sort of a pinch of salt. I thought again that Lisu, this sort of Estonian woman, or sort of more tolerance towards LGBT individuals, again was limited. So I don't understand why they have to have a gay parade, because heterosexual people don't have a parade, so why do you need to advertise? Supporting LGBT people to an extent, but not entirely. And again, this sort of positive attitude, again, was sort of limited to some degree. Eva, she was sort of talking about her male friends who said that actually their attitudes hadn't really changed. They knew that, you know, in Poland they could have discussed their negative attitudes quite openly, but she knew that sort of in the UK that this was sort of considered unacceptable. So if sort of people were not criticising homosexuality openly, that didn't necessarily mean that they were supportive of it. Most of the Polish guys I know, they're against homosexuality, but now when they're in England they say okay, no problem, but they're still against it. And also, again, the more positive attitude, not necessarily acceptance, it really is sort of tolerance. Felix, this Polish man, you know, I don't mind it as long as I've got nothing to do with it. So it's not really sort of acceptance, but he will sort of tolerate their existence as long as he doesn't have to come into contact with them. Finally, just to sort of sum up the main points that we found. So migration means you're sort of extricated from sort of mechanisms of social control, such as the media, political rhetoric, the church, and that sort of has a sort of a positive impact. Resocialization, so moving to a country where attitudes are sort of more liberal, gay issues are sort of discussed sort of by politicians. You know, even the Tories sort of introduced gay marriage, so it has become sort of more normal. Greater visibility and in particular personal contact had a sort of a significant impact on attitudes, positive impact. You know, practically every soap opera now has to have a gay character, so this is the sort of constant representation. And then part of it was just the fact that it was London. A lot of them had sort of initially moved to sort of smaller towns and cities and then moved to London. Being in London was sort of a big factor. They sort of recognised that, you know, London is big, it's impersonal, people don't really sort of want to know your business because they're too busy getting on with their own lives. That is sort of partly sort of feeds into why they thought people weren't that sort of bothered about other people's sexualities.